it reminded early anatomists of the fact that it looked a little bit like a seahorse. Maybe, perhaps, but it's found in the medial temporal lobe, and it consists mostly of gray matter, the hippocampus, which means that there's a lot of nuclei in this area. And again, the fact that it's a bulge, just to point this out, the fact that it's identifiable like this is suggestive of the fact that there's a lot of soma in this particular area, and that's why it makes this cluster like this. And it's the memory forming center. And so it helps, a little bit more detail in this, it helps to convert your short-term memory into long-term memory. All right, that's interesting too. So, and then I was saying before that memories are related to emotions as well. And so people that have damage to the hippocampus have trouble forming new memories. I find that to be pretty interesting. Okay, so that so in other words, a negative, we're able to determine what the hippocampus does when it's not functioning properly. But yet, the things that they experience then just simply fade away. But what's interesting about this is that their long-term memory is still intact, which is suggestive that long-term memory is not where it's not stored in the hippocampus. And so this area right in here, as you can see here, I know that it's difficult to see. Again, it's one thing in a picture like this to put blue arrows here, and you're like, look at this, it's the dente gyrus, which is thought to contribute to the formation of new memories. It's this sort of area within the hippocampus in particular that is where new memories are formed. But it'd be another thing to be able to identify it in an actual brain. It's pretty difficult. And so memories, as I was saying before, are not stored in the hippocampus, but rather cognitive and sensory experiences are organized and unified in terms of long-term memory, and that is throughout the cerebral cortex. And so when you experience something like touching something very hot for the very first time, okay, you'll remember that, right? The hippocampus learns from the sensory input that's not good to be touching fire. And then it plays the memory back repeatedly if that were to occur again, or it sort of like conditions it a little bit into the cerebral cortex. So therefore, long-term memory is established. This concept is called memory consolidation. And so, boy, if this is not understating this, I mean, this is how learning is taking place. And so this video isn't about that, but I hope you're appreciating the magnitude of what we're kicking around right here in terms of how the hippocampus will pick up short-term experiences, sensory and otherwise, and then consolidate them into long-term memory for future. So it's kind of cool in terms of how the body uses its brain in order to respond in the future. And so learning can be thought of as a behavioral modification to previous experience. Okay, so think of the hippocampus's way of teaching the cerebral cortex. Okay, that's kind of a funny way to think of it, but memory consolidation continues in the form of long-term memory, and again, which is held in a variety of areas, and this video isn't about that, but different memories are housed in different locations within the cerebral cortex. That's pretty interesting there. And so more about the various components or structures within the limbic system. The fornix is a particular tract of white matter that connects the hippocampus, shown here, with the hypothalamus. And the fornix, the term itself is kind of an interesting term. Each of these are related to either Greek or Latin, but I find this to be somewhat interesting. So if you don't mind, there's a little sidebar on this. The fornix, it comes from, like, when you think of back in the Roman gladiator times, and some of those events had prostitution or prostitutes hanging out around the Colosseum. And so when people said that they were going to go to the arches of the Colosseum, the fornix, it was kind of associated with the fact that that might mean that they were going to go pick up a prostitute, and so fornicate comes from this idea of fornix. And that to be kind of interesting. And so right at the very tip of the hippocampus, you get these two almond-like structures called the amygdala. And this is known as the aggression center. And again, that's, simplification. Hopefully, this is intriguing enough to stimulate further understanding, but this is your aggression center in the brain, the amygdala. But the truth is that it acts as an interface between the limbic system and the cerebrum. In other words, various sensory systems need to be called into play here. And so this whole idea of the emotional response of the limbic system being separate from a sort of rational, thought-provoking decision-making isn't really true. There's lots of connection and communication that goes from decision-making and aggression, whether or not to act or to not act accordingly. And so just to sort of bring this up, how do we know these things and stuff? So in other words, when the amygdala is stimulated, and I won't go into necessarily how that occurs, but I'll just put a plus here saying that the neurons can be stimulated, in other words, caused to be fired in the brain. And what we see in not only in animal models, but also in humans, we see an increased anger, violence, fear, and anxiety. So this anxiety is stimulated by the amygdala. And again, this isn't necessarily, don't think of it as being such a bad thing, but anxiety and fear is useful information in terms of getting us out of harm's way. I mean, one could say that those members of the population that didn't have a lot of anxiety and fear didn't survive. Okay, so I just can be blunt about that. So anxiety disorders, however, are curious when we study things that aren't going well. So anxiety disorders, or experiencing an anxiety attack, is overboard. So having too much is bad. And so sometimes these patients are prescribed medication. And again, I'm not a physician, but one of the more common pharmacological medicines that are given are these sort of benzoid diazepam, or just benzoids, if you difficult pronouncing that. So they act basically to inhibit the amygdala. And so what is happening here is that it's sort of a mellowing effect. These benzoids provide sort of a calm if you're experiencing anxiety to a hyper state. And so what that does is, interestingly, these medications cause hyperorality, meaning that the individual has maybe increased desire to putting things in their mouth, increased hunger, or hypersexuality, increased desire for sexual activity. And this is curious, less inhibited behavior, so more reckless under the influence of benzoids, which is kind of curious. All of these sort of, if I could make this simplified, are a little bit related to benzoids. Act a little bit like what alcohol might be doing to a person. In other words, increasing sexual activity, hunger, and also inhibiting behavior a little bit, like sort of running around with the lampshade. So inhibited, like your social controls are not fully functional. And so, again, superficial understanding of that. And so what's happening here is that the outputs from the amygdala goes either to the hypothalamus, and if that's the case, the hypothalamus is going to act on a sort of autonomic basis. It's going to, as I mentioned before, it's going to produce these hormones, and it's going to cause perhaps increased heart rate, or it's going to produce indirectly influence the production of cortisol and adrenaline, for example. Or it could go to the prefrontal part of the cortex as well. And so that helps to think about what is happening. And so as I was saying, the hypothalamus influences visceral and somatic motor systems, ultimately heart rate, that sort of thing, breathing rate, respiration, hormones, like your heart racing. Whereas the prefrontal influence is conscious response. In other words, like as a result of this emotion, you might act on it. In other words, I'm going to do this act of violence, or I'm going to tell someone, keep it positive, tell someone that I love them. Or it could be, though I'm feeling this, I'm going to actually consciously control this anger and not act on it. Okay, and so just to wrap this up, again, these two little, small but powerful little almond structures right here, amygdala, are all controlling that area. Now, the thalamus is, I mentioned a little bit hypothalamus. The thalamus is superior to the hypothalamus, and there's two lobes to it. And basically, it's a relay system where all kinds of nerve impulses are coming into the thalamus, and that's sending and routing all of that information, all the different parts of the brain. So clearly, if you're following this, the thalamus has to be part of this limbic system. It has to be, because these emotions are related to and contingent on things that we're seeing. So sensory information that comes into this thalamus, and then that gets shot out to different areas in the cerebral cortex. Things that you touch and hear, we're going to have a response to. And so, in particular, just to point this out, it's in this interior part or sub-region right in here. And again, if you're a neuroscientist, you get into all these little substructures within parts of the brain, and that is part of this interior nuclei are part of the limbic system, because it's affecting related to emotion. Okay, and so as I was saying, this interior nuclei, and again, interior nuclei, don't get overwhelmed. It's just the soma involved in the neurons, and that relays information from, for example, the mammillary bodies to the cingulate gyrus. The mammillary bodies are also involved in memory, right in here, and reticular formation. If you're familiar with that, these are tracts of neurons that either stimulate or inhibit emotion, and these are found within the thalamus, and the range of emotion. So rage and fear, pain, sexual arousal, pleasure, these kinds of things are being routed and being sent to different parts of the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and that's happening in the thalamus, which is right in this location right there. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that presentation on the lymphatic system, and hopefully it stirred your curiosity. And thanks for watching.